Hi guys, welcome to episode 1 of Beyond Binary Thinking. We're exposing the logical fallacies that come from binary thinking. The process of this podcast is simple. We maintain that any time someone has trapped their thinking in a false dichotomy, left versus right, us versus them, good versus evil, then they're oversimplifying and they're preventing dialogue by limiting what could be a rich conversation to the equivalent of a wrestling match.
We hope to offend anyone that holds entrenched views, pop some bubbles, air out some echo chambers, see if we can tackle familiar controversies, and try and find a third way, a second dimension, or maybe just a fresher perspective. From Spain, I'm Finn Branham.
From Amsterdam, I'm Marijn Hogenscheid.
And from London, I'm Chris Cook.
So today's nonsense is brought to you by Chris. What do you have for us today? Chris, what sacred cows need slaughtering?
Well, have you guys heard the story of Christians being fed to lions for the entertainment of these vomitorium-loving Romans?
Yeah, classic, isn't it?
Or the story of the American pilgrims fleeing to the New World to escape religious persecution? So there's all these stories that have entered our collective understanding of the world. However, they are widely refuted by modern historians as complete fabrications. The history of both Christianity and atheism is wrong. I think the idea that Christians were persecuted as martyrs, or the idea that they held back scientific advancement, that they were burning libraries and starting crusades, it's all nonsense, and I'm hoping to take us beyond this example of binary thinking. Far too easy to pick apart a literal reading of a King James version of the Bible. Know a lot of atheists that claim to be enlightened and rational in comparison to these gullible believers. However, I find it fascinating that they've fallen into the same self-serving bias, and they've fallen for their own revisionist versions of history. I hear these divergent creation myths from both atheists and Christians, and I'd like to share the view from modern historians that neither the Dark Ages nor the Renaissance actually existed, and the narratives we've learned about them are wrong.
So, Chris, you don't believe Christians held back scientific improvement? Didn't they burn libraries?
Well, there's the story of the Great Library of Alexandria, which was famously burnt. Depending on who you ask, most accounts contradict with one another, and there's several reports that it was destroyed, with Christians blaming the pagans and the Roman empires, the pagans and Islamic scholars blaming Christians. So it depends who you ask. And these conflicting things really lead to what is probably not an accepted and respected version of history. Now, there's this atheist creation myth popularized by Carl Sagan and more recently by Neil deGrasse Tyson in his series Cosmos that just doesn't fit into a modern understanding historians share about the period. It's similar in the way that during the Crusades in the 12th century, Muslims were blamed for burning the books. So I think each group has a reason to revise that history in their head and make their own version. And what you end up with is a fascinating myth that Christianity intentionally burned heretical knowledge. They plunged the world into the Dark Ages, and they set back the progress of society thousands of years with all their inquisitions and crusades until finally we were rescued by the enlightening age of the Reformation, and where we were freed from the shackles of organized religion to become true scientists.
Okay, but we do know that many heretical texts were lost to time. Some of them were found. In 1945, the Nag Hammadi library was found in Egypt. These were some texts ranging between 100 AD to 300 AD. This was the Neoplatonist time of Christian thought to these Christian texts. And a lot changed around 300, 400 AD, first with the Vestal letters that banned non-canonical Christian texts from being practiced in the church. And then we had Saint Augustinus, very influential Christian philosopher in 400 AD, that very much determined the line where Christian thinking went on during the Middle Ages. And the rediscovery of certain ancient texts, certain Platonical mystical Christian thinking, first in the Renaissance, and then culminating in the 1945 discovery of the Nag Hammadi library, which really put a scientific truth to it. There were really old manuscripts. A lot of them were not considered to be official part of Christian thinking for a very long time. And we've been able to deduce alternative Christian histories from these heretical texts.
Yeah, no, I think that's a valid point. I think the whole period is fascinating. Anyone that's looked into the history of Christianity has seen that, since the Council of Nicaea, where they had this decision to try and consolidate a bunch of different texts. They were deciding, okay, what's going to go into the official Bible and what's not. And ever since that period, anything else was declared heresy. Religions and different scholars have incorporated them into their thinking. I think what I reject is the version of the story where Christians are burning scientific manuals. Right, that's different between Christians deciding what they want to include in their holy book and what they want to forbid. And there's some really interesting thinkers that were lost in that purge. So there's a guy called Origen who invented the concept of the Holy Trinity. And he had this idea that the biblical stories were symbolic parables, right? So for him, he probably came up with an idea that many of us hold today about religion. And it's fascinating, but you can understand why those beliefs were unpopular.
There was a 12th century Renaissance when Christian clerics reached out to their Muslim and Jewish counterparts in Spain to translate text. Just because they'd stopped being copied and shared in Alexandria didn't mean the ideas died. The merging of Greek, Christian and Muslim ideas has happened many times. It's when it happened amongst the rich merchant classes in Venice, probably because those people feel closer to modern society than the monks doing the same thing 500 years before.
The period is called the Dark Ages by some, when, objectively it's not. So at the time, it wasn't the case that we were plunged into ignorance, and it wasn't the church holding people back, in my humble opinion. Monks were, the equivalent of the printing press at the time, and they were making copies and copies of manuscripts. And during the so-called Dark Ages, you saw the invention of the novel, wind and water mills, modern universities, clocks, logarithms. They were able to combine mathematics and physics for the first time. And although Italian and classic historians lament the fall of the Roman Empire, by all accounts, life expectancy went up. For most people, life was better. And although they weren't living in a so-called glorious empire, it was a relatively long period of peace and prosperity, although it was more fragmented, probably more resembled culture that we have today.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I think it's also worth noting that during the Dark Ages, the Islamic Caliphate in Spain that went from 711 to 1429, I believe, this is a period when the whole of Spain, the Iberian Peninsula basically was, apart from the very north part, was united under Islam. And Cordoba was the capital. It had a very large library, some say with 500,000 books. And it was a centre of trade and commerce in Europe that linked the cultures of Christianity, Islam and Judaism. So that's an interesting counterexample. And under this caliphate, there was some big advancements, like you mentioned, Chris, in science, in mathematical thinking, among many others. So while we say it's the Dark Ages, perhaps that's like a Christian-centric version of looking at that period of history. What do you think of that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's fascinating that, the only reason we call it Dark Ages is because of the historical revisionism that came from the Protestant was the Renaissance Protestant?
Later. It started out much earlier. Yeah. I mean, it's where do you define it? There was the French part of the Enlightenment, but it started as early as, I think, 1400, when people were sent out to collect ancient texts, because there is a point to, of course, it's a very ethnocentric view. This is the history of Europe, right? This is not the history of the world. There was not the Dark Ages as there is the Tricerata time period. This is a history of Europe, and that is the history of the world in a lot of ways. Europe is the dominant cultural factor. I have a great book. It's called Europe and the People Without History. And it tries to more point out that the history of the world was never billiard balls on the pool table knocking against each other, different civilizations, but ever since maybe the origin of man even, we've had connections, we've had contact. Tribes did negotiate with each other, they traded with each other, language traveled, culture and history is intertwined throughout the world. But the version that we wrote was the version of the dominant European seafarers, the traders, the colonizers. But I think there is a point to be made, to get back to the subject, that the Dark Ages were a time where Christian clergy ruled over a lot of thought in Europe, much more so restrictive than, as Finn pointed out, in the Islamic world at the time. A lot more scientific achievements, a lot more philosophical achievements were made in the Islamic world in that period. And I think when we refer to the Dark Ages, we refer to the fact that in that time of 300, 400 AD, a lot of the more freer, mystical, and scientific views of Christianity were abandoned for a more restricted clergy view of Christianity. And when the Renaissance came and the Age of Enlightenment came, this was rediscovered.
True, but the irony is rediscovered by our ethnocentric bias culture.
By Europeans. Well, yeah, it was never lost in the East.
It wasn't lost.
It was never lost in the Amazon.
Advancement was still continuing. As Finn hinted at, there were Christian scholars who were engaging with Muslim and Jewish clerics in Spain and continuing to incorporate this information. And, some of the terms you said about Enlightenment and Renaissance, that's a history written by Protestant historians who are discussing when they freed themselves from the repressive shackle of the Catholic Church. Now, of course, the Catholic Church had its problems and its evils and its tyrannies. But, so did the Roman Empire before it. Because it had its zeitgeist and its era when it was in power, it therefore took responsibility for a lot of wars. And I've heard a lot of atheists discussing how we wouldn't have war if it wasn't for Christianity or Islam or things like that. And I think it's nonsense, because I think we've always had war. Look at the Soviet Union, obvious example of an atheist country where they killed lots of people and also had lots of war. So I don't think warfare comes from religion. I think both religion and warfare come from being human.
Yeah, come from society. They're different aspects of society. How do we refine religion anyway? If we look anthropologically, the definition of religion is one of the most difficult subjects we have. There are about 240 different ones.
What, definitions or religions?
The definitions. Religion is probably a lot more than 240 if we're looking worldwide. How do you look at it? I think I had this really great quote from Clifford Geertz, an anthropologist, who points out to the symbolical value it has to motivate people.
Right.
And I think it usually comes down to symbols as well. Religion is very much a symbology to make sense of certain values, morals, values, things we cannot properly explain.
So that's one interpretation of Christianity or of religion in general, which I think is really interesting and that I hadn't really considered before, because it's common for atheists to knock down the kind of straw man that Chris mentioned earlier of the literal interpretation of the Bible, for example. But when you look into the Bible, there's lots of symbology there. And maybe from using that symbology, it gives us a way to understand the kind of everyday moral dilemmas of human existence, right? Good and evil, or of, Adam and Eve is a really interesting one. The story of Adam and Eve and the snake and the problem of evil. It's really interesting symbologically. So maybe looking at it from a perspective of Carl Jung and the archetypes and symbology, there's a lot to be gained from looking at these texts. And maybe we're throwing the baby out with the bathwater if we just reject all of religion without looking in more detail at some of the symbology.
Well, that was Origen's point, who I talked about from the Great Library of Alexandria. I mean, this was fascinating, my research to find out about him, because, I can see how it lends itself much more to a modern understanding of Christianity.
What's a modern understanding of Christianity?
I think it's fair to call bullshit.
This ties into the difference between the Dark Ages and the Age of Enlightenment, the Age of the Renaissance. Because what is the Renaissance? The Renaissance is the reinvigoration, the juvenilization of the ancient Christian text, of the Platonic Christian
As I said,
text,
none of this is new, right?
So in the Renaissance, the modern thinking was actually the classical thinking. So what is then modern Christianity?
And I've just fallen into the same trap, right? I've just been like, okay, now our smarter, new, invigorated understanding of religion, as you point out.
Rewriting history.
It's been, from the earliest days of the religion, there's been those that have seen it as a parable, and a mythology to be interpreted as valuable. And there's also been people that have seen it as a way to control the masses and have power.
Yeah, there's one quote that I heard that says something like, religion is like a tool. It's like a knife and fork, right? You can use it in different ways. You could use it to stab someone or to control people, or you could use it to eat food and digest, like a tool that can help you to live your life. My belief is any religion you could use as a tool. And if it's practical and pragmatic in your life and helps you in some way, then great. But I guess it can also be used, like you say, as a method of control. to stop people maybe rising up against the structure, against the power structure that's in place.
And indeed, it has been viewed either way, depending on the group. They've cherry-picked their examples. So when Christians have been upset with Muslims, they blame them for the burning of the Great Fire of Alexandria. When Protestant historians are criticising the Catholic Church, they blame them for it. Christians earlier still were blaming the pagan Roman emperors. So yeah, people can cherry-pick their examples of times when Christians have been phenomenally lovely, or when they've been absolutely terrible. It's been around thousands of years. There's no shortage of examples depending on which revisionist version of history you want to cherry pick from. But that's the entire point of this discussion, is to take it beyond that binary level of thinking, right?
So I'm wondering, when I both hear you speaking, if you would be talking about this, which would be, for example, capitalist economy. This also is a set of symbols, a tool that can be used for good and bad. It is something that's very influential in driving people, driving their motivations, their moral systems. So again, where do you put the line of religion? What do we refer to when we say religion, right? How far of a cultural concept do we want to take this?
For me, as an evolutionary psychologist, I see religion on the macro level, and that's what I'm trying to discuss today, because it's easy to look at it as old and parochial and old-fashioned, but you have to realize that at a time it moved people and made them work together and collaborate and share much better than any other process that's been tried before. And you have people from Far East Asia to Western Africa all united under Islam. Likewise, you have Christianity all around the world, and it made groups come together and work together and get beyond their tribal instinct of the small in-group. So just like capitalism, it's a tool, it's been used, there are good agents and bad agents.
So you're saying made, you're talking about your past tense. I don't see religion at the moment as being a past tense influence in the world, though. Some of the larger countries in the world are very much dominated by religion currently, both in the Christian world, looking at the United States, as is the Islamic world. Look at Turkey, the first secular Islamic country, now becoming a much more traditional Islamic state, right? So I think we're seeing the reinvigoration of the religious influence.
Look at America. Could you ever imagine them voting for an atheist?
Yeah.
It's not going to happen.
Well, America always has it. Yeah, always had it. You have to swear on the Bible.
It's on the money, isn't it? In God we trust.
Yeah. There's no secular society in the United States. I have a question for the both of you, because this is something that I saw online this week. I wasn't sure what to think of it. And it's that when we're talking about atheism versus religious people, atheists always or often refer to themselves as agnostic atheists. And then they tend to explain the difference between Gnosticism, Gnostic atheism, Gnostic Christianity, agnostic Christianity. And I feel that this sometimes may be born out of a sense of not wanting to offend the hardcore believers that say God is real. And if you're being a Gnostic atheist, you would say, no, God is definitely not real. And I think people tend to rather call themselves agnostic atheists. Yeah, I don't know, but maybe you're right. Let's leave it in the middle. Let's not make it too big of a deal. But then on the other hand, atheism is very much founded on scientific investigation, scientific laws, scientific truths. And this comes from a position of knowledge. And Gnosticism is knowledge. So I'm wondering why I rarely see people calling themselves Gnostic atheists, and so often people calling themselves agnostic atheists. Do you guys have a viewpoint?
Yeah, I'm gonna have to disagree with you slightly there. I probably would consider myself agnostic. I'm skeptical of anyone that's certain of whether there is or isn't a God. For me, faith is the opposite of certainty. And I learned that from a fascinating conversation I had with a Franciscan friar when I was living in Canterbury. He invited me into the monastery, we had tea, and we had a really interesting discussion, and he was full of doubt. And I, likewise, don't think that being certain is wise or more intelligent or more scientific. In fact, many atheists, well, definitely many scientists, proudly say that they don't know, and that's their strength philosophically, and that's their strength in discussion and exploring ideas, because only a pope or a king has to tell the world, I know, I am certain. We get our wisdom from knowing that we don't know anything and trying to explore from that basis. So I will have to contend with what you just said.
So then you would say as well that the best position is just agnostic position in general. Should we strive for agnosticism?
I feel so.
Conclude that we are agnostic beings because we can't know.
Well, yeah.
But we strive to know.
I see the argument in, how can a fish understand our world? And likewise, when someone has a strong opinion. I think best position's probably overstating it, but at the same point, I think that the desire to be right and the desire to be certain and the desire to know and tell people and tell ourselves that we know is born of ego rather than the certainty that it's claiming.
Do you think this could be the attractiveness of the position of atheism or theism of some variety for many believers, that, we're living in a world that's full of uncertainty, right? And disorder and chaos, and we try and make order out of this in society and maybe in our thought structures. Could it be that this order created by this, maybe a false sense or a real sense, depending on how the person feels about it, of knowledge, gives us this certainty against like the kind of uncertainty of life? Do you think that's part of the appeal of atheism and any kind of theism?
Absolutely, and not just the certainty of the ego and the comfort of feeling you found an answer, but it comes from the ability to also form an in-group with like-minded people. And I think that's maybe the problem with agnostic groups. I'm not sure agnosticism has a strong set of beliefs you can gather around and identify with. I see fervent Richard Dawkins-style atheists, and they love that. They get in that group, they feel the same, they shout the same arguments, they share the same YouTube clips. Richard Dawkins destroys stupid Christian. It's hard to be passionate about not knowing something. It's difficult.
Can I ask you another question, Chris? Just going back to Maraine's original question. If you consider yourself an agnostic to do with theism, do you also consider yourself an agnostic to, for example, the Norse gods or Santa Claus or the Easter Bunny? That's a typical argument used by atheists, right? They say, against agnostics, they say, well, are you agnostic about Santa Claus?
So my favourite description of religion is 4 blind men trying to feel an elephant. And one's stroking the trunk, and it says, like so, God is like this. And then one's touching the tusks, and one's touching the legs, and one's touching the tail. Each one describes their experience of the spiritual, of the divine. And I think even someone that says, no, there is no God, this is just a projection of our collective unconsciousness born out of the parables that help guide our cultures and that are universal to all man, even that is an attempt to describe the same thing. We're all aware that there's something more than the empirical in front of us. There's something deeper and spiritual that people describe many different ways. Even some atheists that are, say, Buddhist, right? Tap into this feeling of the consciousness of the universe. I've heard it phrased many different ways, but so for me, it's not about rejecting them all and choosing a winning football team. It's just a different attempt at describing a certain thing.
But isn't Buddhism and Gnosticism, I think, in extension as well, an empirical search for truth, for knowledge? And maybe in a way we need to as well get beyond the agnostic Gnosticism binary divide as well, that we both at the same time may not know the full elephant, but we can still touch the elephant and make certain observations about that. And I think this is as well as what sometimes drives the Christianity or the theism, which with theism we're often referring to Islamic, Abrahamic, Christian, Judaism religions, right? We're not often pointing to Buddhism, even though when people love to call Buddhism a spirituality that is all about self-investigation. But if you go to Asia, there's plenty of Buddhism cults and religious factors that we would see Christianity.
Go to Asia
right?
and try insulting Buddha and see how they treat
you.
Like, you're going to have a bad
time. So a lot of it is infused with culture and other elements as well. But I think that there is a point to when you touch the elephant, then you are able to say certain things about it. Maybe. For example, the fact that we can say that the Earth was not created 2,000 or a few thousand years ago, right? I don't know what the creation myth is. 10,000 years ago, we have fairly good empirical evidence that the world is a bit
It
older
wasn't
than
created
that,
in 7
right?
days, and there wasn't a talking snake.
And
Yeah,
similarly, whatever your definition of God is, I think the Gnostic pursuit is to get to know God by empirical means, by using the tools, both magical, symbolical, that you have, to get a sense of it. Maybe only touch the trunk, but
I
at least you touch the trunk.
wholeheartedly agree. I think the beauty is in the synthesis of the two. I think I get frustrated with atheists who try and claim that science is an alternative to religion. I don't think it is. It's not a religion. And I see the way they're talking. They want it to be. They want Richard Dawkins as their pope. They love being certain and telling people they're wrong and they're stupid and they are enlightened. The way they talk about themselves is exactly how religious groups talk about themselves. It's the same stereotype. Likewise, I pity religion when they try and argue with science and trying to make an excuse for why carbon dating doesn't work, make an excuse for why scientists are wrong. I think they end up the god of the gaps, and what they're trying to do is just explain smaller and smaller things that scientists can't explain. And I think it's poor when the two try and contradict each other, because ultimately that's a case of one trying to have authority over the other, dominance over the other. And as long as that happens, we're going to end up with this silly binary tribalistic thinking. Finn, I know you have something to say about this.
It's a really interesting point. And David Hume, the philosopher, famously said, you can't derive an ought from an is, which basically means if you know what things exist, it tells you nothing about the way that you should act. Right, and that's basically what you're saying, is that science tells us exactly, or tries to tell us what's going on, why it's happening, how it's happening, but it doesn't then provide any should, right? Some people believe that religion is a guide for how you should live your life, but should be replaced by the scientific method in terms of explaining how the world is. So perhaps there's some non-contradiction there between the morality of religion and letting science explain the how and the what is.
I was wondering if that's really true, if science really does not have anything to say about our moral order. And for me, when I think about religion and science influencing the moral order, I'm very much struck by countries that are very secular, very much science dominated, and still have a very strong moral code. And then I look at America, where Christianity is very strong, and especially I've seen, what we all have seen happening this week with the detention centers in the United States, and the very much most religious groups, with the religious foundings that are not as empathetical and understanding, but which you see in the Republican atmosphere, as groups that are liberal, progressive, scientist based. So does science really not make people maybe a bit more moral? Maybe there's a moral guide there as well that we're not seeing.
I think there's a bit of a false dichotomy there, though, because it's not the case that Democrats are scientists, atheists, and Republicans are Christian.
Very simple, fairly simply said. True, but we do see in America a very Christian society that not necessarily the empathy moral code is shining through everywhere. And we do see an empathy moral code shining through in scientific-based communities. So what's causing this?
So the studies into the morality of religion and how religious you are and its effect on how moral you are fascinating. And the relationship is actually U-shaped. What we find is that those with the least religion in their lives and those with the most religion in their lives. So those who have rejected the church because, in their opinion, it is found wanting and they're trying to find a better way, are very, very moral. And there's multiple psychological studies that have shown this. And then the very, very religious, the very pious, the people that dedicate themselves to joining a group and following a code of conduct, they are also a very moral group of people. The least moral group of people, it's a case of a little knowledge being a dangerous thing. And so the people in the middle that occasionally go to church, consider themselves superior to everyone else, but actually don't know what they're talking about, are the least moral group compared to the atheists and compared to the very religious. So it's a fascinating relationship.
How was morality measured in those experiments, out of curiosity?
There's various things. One is the prisoner dilemma game, where you can work out whether someone's going to share or steal money with a partner. There's other metrics as well. The problem is some of them are reliant on self-reporting questionnaires, which obviously have a problem. But if you look at terms of like altruistic giving to various charitable causes, that also correlates with it. And as I say, the most famously prisoner dilemma experiment, where you're put in a room with a stranger and you're given the choice to steal from them or share and mutually benefit. So
I wanted to make a point quickly about Moraine. You were talking about Buddhism, and you mentioned that the culture can have an influence on the religion. And relating back to my earlier point, that I thought your point was very good, and so I wanted to clarify slightly in what I was saying. And the way you could look at it is in terms of, if you imagine two circles, an inner circle and a bigger outer circle, and you can imagine all the different religions around the outer circle being the more tradition, culture, and the way the religion is practiced. And if you go to the inner circle, this could be more the esoteric as opposed to the exoteric. So in the esoteric sense, most religions have a lot in common, right? Don't kill, be good to your neighbor. This thing Chris was talking about, making the community bigger than just the family, give to charity, help the needy. So I find this really interesting that all religions, in fact, whether it be Dharmic religions or Abrahamic religions, have this core sort of moral system. And maybe, Moraine, your point about scientific and secular liberal societies being very moral maybe picks up on this element of the esoteric nature of morality. That could be something non-religious, perhaps. Maybe that's just something human. What do you guys think of that analogy, that distinction?
Human, or, well, universally human for sure. I think there's an inner esoteric sense that seems to be universal. But the exoteric is in a way also universal, because what the exoteric is generally it's rituals that reinforce the esoteric. It can be also rituals of change, the rites of passages that we see in any religion, in any culture, that push us from a certain type of being and a certain type of identity states to another. You're pointing to a very interesting element of religion, in that there is esoteric and there are exoteric elements. And I think the esoteric definitely is a lot more communal amongst all religions. At least this is something that in my own investigations I've been exploring. You can see it even in Amazonian, in the ayahuasca tribes. I think a lot of Buddhist people are very attracted to those type of rituals as well. You might be talking about the universal sense, but are we not then talking about the existence of God? Is that not
possibly
sort of internal esoteric drive to hope to achieve well?
I think one of the most difficult things, something you said, Chris, you reminded me of something I told you years ago, that it's important to define your terms. And it always seems to be difficult talking about an issue like God with a capital G, because there's so much associated cultural baggage with the term, right? So my point is, I guess, it's difficult to talk about God and not get trapped into this binary thinking. Maybe this is a bit idealistic of me, but do you think it's possible to have this debate with people using a different word that doesn't have any cultural associations to it? Replacing the actual word God with a different word to discuss this, like what you just said, Monet, like a search for the personal divine or something like that.
So I'll let Chris answer this, but I just want to interject one short thing, is that I love using the word God with anyone, even though I consider myself much more a Buddhist, Zen, Taoist influenced thinker. I just love using the word God, especially with people that have more scientific background, because I don't believe in this whole difference between atheism and theism. I think I see it in a much more holistic sense, and God can mean anything I want it to mean with it.
Indeed. I've met a Church of England priest who said that God is love, and that they're not sure they believe in a man in the sky who looks at your naughty and nice list and decide who gets to... I'm not sure there's a man that lives in the sky that gets to see who's been naughty and who's been nice and gets to decide whether they get a bit of heaven cake or hell.
Santa Claus, basically.
God is pretty much, yeah. It's the same idea, right? And he said he wasn't sure if he believed in that understanding of God at all. For him, God was love. God is the universal. It's what binds us together. It's what men have in common. And it's what makes us more than animals.
Maybe it's going a bit off topic here, but you could, maybe my same point could be applied to the term love, right? Love is a word that can mean so many different things to different people, depending on the context. You know, the Greeks defined it into 3 or 4 different ways. I guess this is me just being kind of idealistic and optimistic about having a less heated debate, right, about these kind of maybe culturally loaded terms. But that's an interesting point, Benaim, that you like to use the word God. That's very interesting. I've tended not to avoid the use of God, maybe for fear of riling people up a little too much, which I seem to do easily enough.
I think I do it both to rile people up, but also because I think Chris mentioned this as well. I do not like the anti-Christianity. I do not like thinking that Christians are always wrong. There's many beautiful Christian philosophical texts that have been written. Monks have done a lot of introspective work in monasteries, in Christian monasteries. And I do not see the difference between Christianity and Buddhism. I think they're just 2 different language dialogues about the same thing. And if you look at the Hermetic texts that have been found in the Nag Hammadi library, what God will be described as will be God is the light of everything, and we are the sparks of that light. And the devil is the antithesis, the darkness from the light. I like it when Alan Watts describes God as the Big Bang, and consider yourself part of the Big Bang, because if everything that is there came from the Big Bang, you came from there as well. And if God is just the continuous evolution and progression of everything, then you are just as much God as anything that's ever happened. So there's so many ways of thinking about it.
I think that's a beautiful thought. And what it means is that we're neither allowing atheists to make God a dirty word, nor are we allowing religious people to own that word and own its meaning. We all have the right to a shared understanding of that word and what it means to us. And I think that nicely takes us to a conclusion, because, gentlemen, I don't think we're going to solve the problem of organised religion today. But what I would like to hear is maybe some of the most ridiculous or contentious opinions you gents have heard on the subject.
I think mine would have to be my grandma. I had this dinosaur book. Maybe this is harsh, but I had this dinosaur book when I was younger, and I was in love with it. I think I was about 4 or 5, and I used to go around showing everyone the dinosaurs. You know, I knew all the names, and my grandma was just she just hated it. You know, she didn't want to know. She didn't want to know anything about it. And it wasn't her opinion, I don't believe, but some people believe that the dinosaurs were put there as a test of faith.
Satan's trap, right?
Right, like the dinosaurs, it's not real. They're not real. They didn't exist. It's just a test. God put them there to test us. And I think that's a really harsh thing to imagine. That's true. Imagine that's what God did. No, just like put us in this test. It seems so harsh and
what with the intention of us learning to refute obvious scientific evidence,
I guess,
to bolster up our faith more strongly.
The whole thing has so many inconsistencies. It's hard to understand why anyone.
That version of God sounds like a bit of a dick. I got to be honest. That's like leaving an empty condom next to your bed to see whether your girlfriend truly trusts you or not. Like, what the fuck?
Right, like that was.
It was just a test. I wanted to see whether you would ignore the obvious evidence in the room. If you loved me, you would ignore the empty condom wrappers that are lying around our apartment, darling.
Right. Which seems a bit of a weird thing to do at best.
The Lord works in mysterious ways. Finn, are there any common logical fallacies you hear coming from Christians or atheists?
Yeah, so I was thinking about this, and I found a few ones that I quite like. I'll start with my favourite one. This one is called "begging the question," and this is a phrase that people commonly misuse. People use it like "it begs the question," blah blah blah. But what they're trying to say is which poses the question. Begging the question is circular reasoning, essentially, reasoning in a circle, or pepitio principii. And the idea is that it's a circular argument, so you have to accept, if you accept any part of the argument, all of it becomes true. One example is, God must exist. How do you know? Because the Bible says so. Why should I believe the Bible? Because the Bible was written by God, right? So then you're just trapped in a cycle, and so this is quite an easy one to spot, and it's quite prevalent, I would say, in kind of the scientific, or the religious thinking of religious scholars, and maybe the most well-known religious speakers, but I'd say maybe on an everyday level, I think it catches a lot of people who are unaware of this fallacy.
Fascinating. My favourite is Pascal's wager. The idea that Pascal was the inventor of probability theory, or at least one of the most prominent figures in it, and he did the maths and worked out that it made sense to believe in God because the amount you paid in time to do it was very little. The potential reward was huge. And so on balance of the probabilities, right, Pascal said, well, I mean, and you can tell by his logic that he didn't believe in God, because he's having to reason it out like this and be like, okay, so I'm going to go through the motions and pretend to believe because it's the safest bet I can make. Now, I always heard that and was like, oh, that's an interesting one, and I wasn't sure there was a way to refute it, but I heard a fascinating one recently, which said, okay, but the problem with Pascal's wager is how many gods are there? It's not a one bet or a wrong bet, right? Because maybe you've bet on the wrong god. And actually, there's tens of thousands of gods. And if you bet on the wrong one, you're in trouble. The argument goes that the difference between a fervent religious person and an atheist is the fervent religious person rejects 1,999 gods, and the atheist just rejects one more.
I like the essential argument of Pascal's wager is like, well, quid's in, may as well.
Insurance policy.
Yeah, but it's like, if, again, imagine that God exists, where they go, well done there, you did Pascal's wager, you get into heaven, good, nice one. If it's that easy, it seems like a bit pointless, doesn't it?
I mean, a god capable of hiding dinosaurs just to fuck with people is capable of all sorts, who knows?
Yeah. Well, then you may as well be quids in with all, right? Why not be quids in with all the gods?
There is a sketch stand-up comedy from Brian Laurie where he is an investment banker who's getting his son christened, and he tells the priest that actually they're hedging their bets, and he's having his son baptized in all of the main religions so he can split the risk differential.
That's pretty good. So then to flip it around, let's look at a logical fallacy that's common among atheists. So this one is it's known as the appeal to ridicule. So this is the idea of, basically the argument goes like this. An invisible man in the sky? How ridiculous. That can't be true. That the idea itself is ridiculous and therefore can't be true is quite a common one. And I think it's easy to take literal interpretations and things from the Bible, which are frankly quite ridiculous, right? Looking at them now, when it was written a couple of thousand years ago, there are frankly a lot of ridiculous things, but I don't think it necessarily refutes the argument, right?
So both atheists and Christians there are taking a literal translation of the King James version of the Bible, right? And in effect, what the atheists are doing is they're picking a nice, easy straw man. So, as you say, it's easy.
Yeah, it's often combined with straw man.
Straw man is very popular. I think straw man is the most popular one amongst atheists. Yeah, so I think with the straw man or the Texas sharpshooter, you cherry pick a certain part to attack, the man in the sky. And this is exactly what I think, that there is not a general idea of God amongst Christianity at all, nor Islam, nor Judaism. Kabbalic Judaism is filled with reincarnation ideas. So we're not talking about a singular group of people. There's many data clusters involved here. And atheists love to just cherry pick among this, to ridicule, to point out the parts that are weak and they're presupposing certain arguments as well. Darwin loves to do, not Darwin, Dawkins loved to do this in his book. He presented the argument for religion that is not the same argument I would have made for religion or God. And so, sure, you can attack the position you made up yourself, but this is really the same position that religious people amongst the world are having when we're talking about religion.
This is what I found when I was an angry, born-again atheist arguing with religious people and saying, oh, look, this part of the Bible's silly. The response I invariably got from them was, yeah, if you say so, I don't know it that well. So it's easy to go through and find fault in the text, but most people, they're just trying to live a good life. They're trying to join a community of like-minded people. And all the raging in the world that comes from Dawkins it makes sense in the context that he runs a department on a university campus and he's discussing whether those other departments have value, right? But when you're going out and berating someone that's just a nice religious person that has the same religion as their parents and their grandparents and all their friends from the village they grew up in, and you're angrily berating them for being stupid, you just realise at one point or another that you're just being a bit of a dickhead.
That brings me on to another one, which is ad hominem, or like personal attack. So people attack the person, therefore his ideas mustn't be true, or can't be true, rather. So this is really common, right? Especially people use it against Richard Dawkins, because he's, the way he goes about stuff, it's not the nicest way in the world. He feels he's justified doing it. And he feels that he's helping people become unentrenched from their perhaps small-minded worldviews, in his view. But people often attack him and they say, well, he's a bit of a dick, isn't he? So... Well, yeah. And then let's not read his book. Let's just go, well, he's a bit of a dick, so ignore him.
Same with the Westboro Baptist Church. You can choose them and go, look how horrible those people are. It's their fault that everything's wrong with the world.
It's a cheap way to kind of score points. Yeah. What about appeal to belief? This is the idea that, and I think it's used perhaps by both sides. It's the idea that, well, loads of people believe this, so it's probably true, or it must be true. It could be. Most people born into a religious society tend to take on that religious view, right? If you're born in a Muslim country, it's rare that people will become Buddhist or become Christian. It happens to some. But equally, if you're born into a Western liberal society, Scandinavia or Northern Europe, generally people aren't religious. So you tend to go with, well, God probably doesn't exist because most people around me don't even believe in it or in him or in her.
Yeah,
what do you guys think about that?
This ties into the idea about culture, right? Religion is culture, and you're born in culture. Culture is what gives you identity. Even though we live in a multicultural society, culture is still very important to give influence to how people behave, which groups they hang out with, how societies are formed. At the same time, I do think as well that in modern age, it is in a way easier to cherry pick your ideas about religion and spirituality.
And what do you think about cherry picking your ideas? Because I'm quite a pro this. I think it's like a toolbox, right? I'm very take a pragmatic approach, and it's like, well, I'm going to try lots of different stuff and see what works for me, what helps me to live a better life, be a better person, feel better about myself, or help improve my life or people around me. And I think there's nothing wrong with that, but it's always an argument I've heard. People say, oh, you're just cherry picking the best bits. It's like, yeah.
No, I don't mean that in a negative way at all. I think we're able to syncretize our own religions right now, and it's exactly what you say. It's a toolbox. Meditation is a knife. Ayahuasca can be a fork. A good book can be a spoon. Having a good conversation with someone that has experience with something can be a teaching moment. So yeah, I definitely believe in the syncretism of religion, At the same time, I'm not sure if that is necessarily the dominant factor in culture. I think culture, people in general want to monetize their own culture. But I think the offer is nowadays, the last 100 years has become a lot bigger than it ever has been in the history of the world.
Richard Dawkins doesn't like the idea that some people pick and choose which parts of the religion they believe in. For him, that's not true religion, and you might as well do away with it. But for me, that's a very authoritarian command and control understanding of how people join groups. People always pick and choose what they like, and there's always the super fans and the people that are sort of slightly involved less fervently. That's the point of cultural expression. Like, there's, otherwise it's a no true Scotsman fallacy, right? There are varying degrees to believe. And obviously someone that's going through a time of severe stress might lean harder on religion at that time than when they're busy and not stressed and not worrying about it too much. So I think it's fine to academically argue with the ideas, but obviously culture is all about, it influences you more or less depending on your circumstances. And as such, you don't have to think in binary. You're either in this group or you're not. It either makes sense or it doesn't. I either like all of the ideas in this team or I don't. Most people do cherry pick. We can say we don't like that, but that's the safety mechanism, right? If everyone toes the party line and thinks completely the same as what the text says, that's scary fundamentalism, and that's what you get in groups such as ISIS.
Yeah, although this is maybe a very, very sensitive subject to go in, but then Islamicism does tend towards a very literal interpretation, right? The Quran is still in a lot bigger way than the Bible seen as the word of God in many Islamic communities.
Yes,
not just the fundamental ones, right?
Okay, but I think that's partly because of the history of Christianity. As you said, it's more come from these multicultural societies. If you go to a society where Christianity is the only religion, they take things more literally. And likewise, we know people from the UK who are Muslims who have a much less strict interpretation of religion. So there's obviously a broad range of views.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. As religion is always a toolbox. Yeah. And there's mystical versions of Islamicism as well, Sufism, for example. And I think as well, if someone that goes through trouble in their life and they find God and they have even just a very limited view of their God, and it helps them be a good person, it gives them the tool to overcome challenges and be there for themselves and for others, then ultimately what is there for me to judge or say about how they interpret their God and how they have their viewpoints? I really agree with Finn. Ultimately, it comes down to the fact that there are tools that you're given in your life. There are things you can use to change the direction of your own life, the direction of others.
And it's tremendous hubris to claim that there's one tool, one true way.
Yeah.
And I see it in both religious and atheist peoples. They decide that their way is the light and the truth and the only way, and any other way is ridiculous. I think we all enjoy cherry picking from a buffet of tools as and when the situation demands it.
Now, the intention here is to promote dialogue and encourage polite conversation. We believe that because we're told it's rude to talk about politics and religion, so few of us have learned how to have a polite conversation when you respectfully disagree with someone. With that in mind, we'd like to invite you, our listening audience, to reach out to us and tell us where you disagree, what points we inevitably missed, and what you'd like to hear us talk about next month. More importantly, I'd like you to reach out to your fellow man and woman. Don't search for someone you agree with to validate your ego. Find common ground with someone you disagree with and keep the conversation going. See if you can go beyond binary. From Spain, I'm Finn Brenham.
From London, I'm Chris Cook.
From Amsterdam, it's Marijn. See you next month.
Bye. Sweet.
See you guys.
Okay.
And stop recording.